discussion because this is issue number one.
Absolutely.
Jobs, jobs, jobs. Also the deficit. And I want to get into the deficit right now. You've made the point that the national debt is exploding. The budget deficit is exploding right now. I want some specific, meaningful cuts. If you were elected a senator from Delaware, what would you cut in the federal budget? And don't just say waste, fraud, and abuse, because everybody says that. What would you cut specifically?
That's a great question, because first of all, we have got to tackle the deficit and the debt, because our deficit is almost becoming equal to our national GDP. When your deficit, a country's deficit, equals your GDP, that's when your currency collapses, your market collapses. We've got to take drastic measures. First of all, cancel the unspent stimulus bill. Second of all, put a freeze on discretionary spending, put a hiring freeze on non-security personnel, and then, of course, when we're talking about cutting government spending, we've got to talk about waste, fraud, and abuse. A recent report came out so that we spend over $1 billion in Medicaid, waste, fraud, and abuse. We're talking about pharmacies billing for prescriptions given to dead people. We're talking about home health care companies billing for patients who were in the hospital. Senator Coburn recently put out a report called Schoolhouse Pork that disclosed millions of dollars that were supposed to go to education funding that instead went to special favors. Now, special favors are something that my opponent knows very much about because he created 12 contingency funds so that he could pay out favors to special interest groups. The courts forced him to close 11 of them, but of the one that remained open, he paid $53,000 in a men's fashion show. He paid another more than $50,000 to appease liberal special interest groups at a time when he brags about balancing the budget by raising our taxes, cutting policemen pay. This is how he chooses to spend our tax dollars. We've got to ask, do we want to send this gentleman to Washington, D.C.? I would say no. He's a career politician who has proven he knows how to play the I'll scratch your back, you scratch my game.
You have a minute to respond.
There's so much to respond to, Wolf. A minute may not be enough. Let me get back to the focus of the question, which is what would you do to tackle the deficit and the debt? I think we have some very large challenges in front of us. The overwhelming majority of federal spending is made up by defense spending, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt. While the President has proposed, and I would seriously consider supporting, a freeze on non-defense discretionary spending for 3 years, which would achieve significant reductions, I've also identified on my website a series of reductions that I would support. Some of them are in agricultural price supports, some of them are in federal office space, for example, or hiring, and several of them are in defense programs. Defense acquisition that the Pentagon itself has already said they no longer need. The C-17 program, for example, or the second engine for the F-35. There's a variety of platforms and programs that I think we can simply do away with as we invest in making our defense and our military more modern, more flexible, more responsive to the real threats we face in the modern world, and as we continue to achieve some savings through the BRAC program and other things that have shown a real capacity to save.
Let's open the discussion on correcting some of the financial issues here by talking about some of your own personal financial problems. And most people know about it by now, including an IRS lien that was for about $12,000 in taxes and penalties from 2005. There was the 2008 mortgage default judgment on your home. You just received your bachelor's degree, as you said, because it took you a decade to pay off the tuition. The question then is, how can voters rely upon your thoughts on how to manage the deficit if you're having such personal financial issues of your own?
Well, first of all, that IRS tax lien, the IRS already admitted that it was a computer error, and my opponent should not be bringing that up, because as I've gone up and down the campaign trail, I've discovered that there are thousands of Delawareans who have faced the same thing. An IRS mistake has caused them greatly, which is all the more reason why we need to reform the IRS, not put them in control of our health care. Second of all, you mentioned education. I don't have a trust fund. I didn't come from a privileged, sheltered background, as my opponent says he did.
But let's stay with the issue of paying bills and managing finances.
I paid for my own college education. I also have a graduate fellowship in constitutional government from the Claremont Institute. I know how hard it is to earn and keep a dollar, and one of the reasons why the Delawareans should be able to trust me is because when I did, in this economy, I worked for nonprofit groups. Nonprofit groups were the first to have been hurt. When I fell upon difficult times, I made the sacrifices needed to set things right. I sold my house, and I sold a lot of my possessions in order to pay off my personal debt and to become in a stronger position. I have worked hard in order to get to the position that I am. So I can relate to the thousands of Delaware families that are suffering right now, and I'm stronger for it. I made it through to the other side, and that's where leadership doesn't count in whether or not you fall. It counts in whether or not you've gotten up, and that's what I've done.
But let's just remember we're in the discussion portion, so if you have anything that you want to address within that response or things that have been said on this topic thus far, go for it.
Well, Nancy, I frankly think that we need to focus in this debate this evening and in the campaign, not on personal financial difficulties or background issues, but really on the issues in front of us, the things that Delawareans are concerned about. How do we tackle the deficit and debt? How do we get Delaware back to work? There's been lots of discussion in the national media about things my opponent has said or done that I frankly think are a distraction from the core issues that Delawareans ask both of us about.
You're just jealous that you weren't on Saturday Night Live.
I'm dying to see who's going to play me, Christine.
Well, let's, on a serious note, let's get through some of the accusations that she'd made, and we'll give you a chance to respond.
Please.
That,
on the idea that somehow I was the one responsible for and being sued for creating 11, 12, she's confusing me with my predecessor,
Well, we're talking about as county executive, Newcastle County executive, you raised property taxes. According to reports, 3 times, 25% hike in the last fiscal year. You proposed new taxes on hotels, paramedic services, even 911 calls from cell phones. Is that true?
No. It's not true that we proposed a tax on calls to the 911 center. And any decent research into that would reveal that. It's difficult, it's complicated, but I'll take a moment to explain.
Explain your record on taxes. Did you increase taxes as the county executive?
Well, let me walk you through for a moment what's happened. Because one of the attacks my opponents made repeatedly is that I've driven the county to the edge of bankruptcy. That's on her newest attack ad. Nothing could be further from the truth. Today, Newcastle County has a surplus. When I became executive in 2005, it had a deficit. I have worked hard over 6 years to defend a very significant reserve, which has made it possible for us to continue to have a AAA bond rating. Out of 3,000, roughly 3,000 counties in America, roughly 30 have a AAA bond rating. And I reached a bipartisan solution that cut more in spending than was raised in taxes.
A quick response, and then we'll move to the next.
You've been criticized for saying that you brought the county to a AAA bond rating. You inherited that good rating. And how would you justify cutting the tax exemption for low-income seniors and disabled seniors, cutting our policemen pay, when you wastefully spent so much money on appeasing the special interest groups? You simply can't justify that. That is a career politician. That is cronyism. We don't need any more of that.
Very quickly, because we got to move to the next series of questions. Do you want to respond to that?
There's a lot to respond to.
Do it in 30 seconds.
That's going to be difficult, Wolf. But I'll tell you that I'm proud of my record as Newcastle County executive. The very hard choices that had to be made to clean up the government. Every time you get a bond rating, you earn the bond rating. Ms. O'Donnell's not familiar with how bond ratings work. Each time you go to the bond market, you are re-rated. Moody's, in their letter of rating just 2 weeks ago, said that it was because of the conservative fiscal policies of my administration that we had re-earned a AAA bond rating from all 3 agencies.
All right, let's move on to the next series of questions on national security, foreign policy right now. 100,000 American men and women are serving in the military in Afghanistan right now. The president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, has now acknowledged he's in direct talks with the Taliban leadership, wants to create what he calls a peace council. Here's the question, and it goes to Mr. Coons. Would you support a negotiated settlement in Afghanistan that includes Taliban representation? Would that be acceptable to you, a deal between Hamid Karzai and the Taliban?
Well, I'm concerned about the security of our troops in the field and about honoring the service and the sacrifice of our veterans. The war in Afghanistan is the war of the 2 that we've been engaged in, Iraq and Afghanistan, that I think was justified by a direct attack on the United States, by the Taliban, who were offering harbor to al-Qaeda, who were the authors of the 9/11 attack. And I think in our 10th year now on the ground in Afghanistan, we have to look hard at whether we're continuing to contribute to America's security by having 100,000 troops on the ground. I would support a negotiated resolution to the war that allowed us to leave security and intelligence assets in place and that allowed us the opportunity to re-engage should the Taliban take control again or allow al-Qaeda to re-emerge as a real threat to the region or to the United States. We've spent $1.3 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan. It has significantly contributed to our debt. We have lost more than 5,000 American servicemen and women. And I've got folks who I am personally close to who are deployed now for their 3rd or 4th tour. We have asked a lot of our men and women in the field. They have delivered brilliantly, but frankly, the mission has exceeded the scope that I think we could initially reasonably expect of them. I am far more concerned about the threats to our security posed by an unstable Pakistan, posed by Iran, and posed by an endless war in a country where we're trying to build a nation where there really hasn't been one in modern times.
You have 1 minute to respond.
Well, I would ask him if he's serious about making sure that Afghanistan doesn't become a safe haven for terrorists, why on the campaign trail he has said that he supports this random time withdrawal. We have to support our men and women who are risking their lives. Many of them have already given their lives over there. A random withdrawal that he has said he supports will simply embolden the terrorists to come out after us even more, saying, I've chased away the superpower. When we withdraw from Iraq, we need to make sure that there are benchmarks in place. Those benchmarks are making sure that there is a government, a representative government over there that serves the needs of the people and that can defend themselves. When we've reached these benchmarks, that's when we withdraw.
You want to respond to that?
No, she said withdraw from Iraq. I suspect you meant withdraw from Afghanistan.
No, from Afghanistan. Did I say Iraq? I'm sorry. Thank you, Chris.
Certainly. If we're talking about Afghanistan, and
yeah, thank you.
You know, frankly, I come from a family of veterans. I come from a family that has dedicated a lot to the service of our nation. And I wear a flag pin every day to remind me of the young man who grew up next door to me, who was killed in Iraq in December 2005. I never take lightly the enormous sacrifices that our servicemen and women have made now and that we ask them to continue making. I don't know how long is too long, but 10 years strikes me as awfully long. And I question whether your standard, whether your principles give us any hope of winding up this war on any reasonable timeline, because frankly, the government of Hamid Karzai has proven itself to be largely corrupt and to be frankly ineffective at establishing control over the whole country. We are doing our best. We have dedicated trillions, hundreds of billions of dollars to this conflict, and I'm frankly deeply concerned that it's a conflict without a reasonable end in sight. There are times in history when the best way to honor the sacrifice of servicemen and women is to come up with a plan to responsibly wind down a conflict.
And that plan should be based on those benchmarks, a benchmarks that means that we have had success. Again, you're saying hollow rhetoric when you say that your top priority is the concern for the safety of us on the homeland if you seriously support this random time withdrawal. Because again, all we're going to do is embolden the terrorists to think that they have more power than they do. And I would ask you, you know, a couple times, whether it's the tax cuts or even here in this kind of veiled, you've gone back and forth in what you just said in Afghanistan. Do you support the president or don't you support the president? With the tax cuts, you're saying that you don't support the president. Are you going to tell him that when he comes on Friday?
Let's stay focused on the issue in front of us, which is Afghanistan. You've suggested gauzy benchmarks. No, we're staying focused on the issue of Afghanistan rather than jumping to other issues.
You said that security.
Let's let Mr. Coons finish his point.
The core issue here is what reasonable prospect do you have for these gauzy benchmarks and timelines you suggest to ever actually result in a withdrawal? In Iraq, there was a modern nation. There was a central government. There was infrastructure in place. In Afghanistan, there hasn't been a nation in decades. And so, despite our 10 years of incredible effort, we are not succeeding in building a nation. As you put it, if the benchmark is self-governance, stability, security, we had a decent shot at that in Iraq.
Well, if you remember, when we were fighting the Soviets over there in Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s, we did not finish the job. So now we have a responsibility to finish the job. And if you're going to make these politically correct statements that it's costing us too much money, you are threatening the security of our homeland.
We're about to wrap up this topic. Let's just get there real quickly and ask yes or a no answer. Is this nation more secure than it was under President Bush? Yes or no?
Yes.
Today, yes or no? Okay. We'll move on to our next topic, and this question goes to Ms. O'Donnell.
Can I say why? We've had more terrorist attacks on our homeland.
But we do need to move on. I know that we've said that the statements out in the national media, the Saturday Night Live skits are distractions. I appreciate that. But to the voter in Delaware, it is the message that they are receiving. So we would be remiss if we did not address this issue. So the comments that you've made in the past, which are in your own words because they're on the videotape, have become the fodder for the late night TV shows. You even released an ad that opened up by saying, "I am not a witch."